What I want to do next is turn to actual examples of educational theorists or educational philosophers in the course of a piece of writing, taking a position on what really is important here. And I've got 8 quotations that I want to read to you, representing all 6 of these here. And what's nice about the 8 that I've selected for you is that all of them advocate one of these as being the most important one, but they also contrast themselves to the other ones by de-emphasizing explicitly one or more of the other ones as being a top educational value. And that's a useful thing to do, so you get a little bit of experience how these things actually come at you when you're dealing with educational philosophy and educational theory, because in many cases they don't use these particular words here. They describe the concepts or the values in other formulations. And so practicing, seeing how they come at you and interpreting them is a useful thing to go through. So let's do that next. All right, what I want to do next is read to you a series of quotations, and after we read them, interpret them to try to figure out what the person is saying is the top educational value, and also by contrast, what other educational value is not a top value, either being de-emphasized or dismissed entirely. All right, quotation number 1. This is from a book by Michael Oakeshott, a British political philosopher of the 20th century. And here he is quoting a teacher who was enormously influential upon him as a young man. And so here's the quotation. "You go to a great school not so much for knowledge as for arts and habits, for the habit of attention, for the art of expression, for the art of assuming at a moment's notice a new intellectual position, for the art of entering quickly into another person's thoughts, for the habit of submitting to censure and refutation, for the art of indicating assent or dissent in graduated terms." End quote. All right, what's nice about this quotation is he's very clear in the first part in terms of what he's against. You go to a great school not so much for knowledge. Knowledge is fine, but that's not the most important thing, Oakeshott's teacher is saying here. Instead, it's arts and habits, and then he goes on to elaborate a number of arts and habits that he thinks are important. So what are all of these things? I think he is advocating method as the most important issue. So let's run through and interpret these specific arts and habits to see how that is so. All right, the first art or habit that he mentions is, quote, the habit of attention. Right? How do you take your mind, which can be unfocused or scattered or focused all over the thing or just in a state of unfocus, and decide to pay attention to something, to focus in on that. Well, it's a method issue about the proper use of one's mind. Second one here, the art of assuming at a moment's notice a new intellectual position. So there are lots of intellectual positions out there, being able to think of things this way, then at a moment's notice, as he puts it, step out of that framework and look at it from this perspective, and then look at it from this other perspective, right, and so forth. That's a method issue. How do you use your mind in such a way as to change the operating assumptions and contextualizing principles that one is using there? For the art of entering quickly into another person's thoughts. Well, this most often comes up in discussion or in debate. You and I are debating something. I'm stating my position, you're stating your position in response. Well, if that debate is going to be fruitful, I have to be able to state my position, but then when you're stating your response or articulating your position, be able to, in my context, step outside of my way of looking at things and understand where you are coming from and the points that you're making in terms of the way that you're doing so. Next, for the habit of submitting to censure and refutation. In many cases, debate and discussion involves critiquing each other's positions. So here he's talking about a methodological principle of being able to articulate a position and then take the heat, not put my position out there and run away or insulate myself from criticism, but be able to put my position out on the table and have you attack it, have you criticize it, have you tell me that my position is ridiculous or faulty or weak in various ways, not lose my cool, accept the criticisms for what they are, and formulate my responses if I think responses are possible here. The final one that he mentions is for the habit of indicating assent or dissent in graduated terms. Now, In many cases, the positions that we're considering are not obviously true or obviously false. Some of them are. If it's obviously false or ridiculous, we can just dismiss it. But how do you develop in yourself the ability to be able to recognize those things when you come across them? Or things that really are obvious and don't require further investigation? How do you develop that method for being able to make those assessments? And in the more difficult situations where there's some evidence for a proposition or for a position, but it's not overwhelming. And so in that situation, well, it's a possibility. Or if the evidence comes in and now it's really very strong, we say, well, that's probable or highly probable. Or if we get to a situation where the evidence that has come in really is overwhelmingly in support of a given position, being able to assess that it really is overwhelmingly in that position and say things like, well, that's beyond a reasonable doubt, or that's proved with certainty, right, or whatever. So being able to make those judgment calls along that spectrum from the ridiculous to barely possible to a strong possibility to a high probability to a reasonable certainty and so forth. That methodology of assessing evidence is another important cognitive skill here. So I think what we have then in this quotation from Oakeshott's teacher is a strong emphasis on cognitive methods, methods of being able to use one's mind fluidly and powerfully in dealing with difficult matters. That, for Oakeshott, is the heart of education. All right, let's try another quotation here. Second one on my list is from Diane Ravitch, perhaps the most famous and influential educational theorist of the early 20th century, or 21st century now. This is from the year 2009, an article written in the Boston Globe newspaper. Quote, "For over a century, we have numbed the brains of teachers with endless blather about process and abstract thinking skills. We have taught them about graphic organizers and Venn diagrams and accountable talk, database decision-making, rubrics, and level libraries. But we have ignored what matters most." All right, now that then is to say, she's saying all of the things that we've just mentioned, those are not the most important thing. And all of the things that we've just mentioned, stepping outside of the quote here, process, abstract thinking skills, graphic organization, and so forth, those are all method issues, exactly the things that Oakeshott's teacher was saying were the most important things. So from Ravitch's perspective, method issues are not the most important thing. So what is? Quote, "But we have ignored what matters most. We have neglected to teach them that one cannot think critically without quite a lot of knowledge to think about. Thinking critically involves comparing and contrasting and synthesizing what one has learned. And a great deal of knowledge is necessary before one can begin to reflect on its meaning and look for alternative explanations." All right, so her point is that knowledge is foundational. You have to have lots of knowledge in place before you can start self-reflectively focusing on the methodology issues of verifying and sorting rather, and classifying and interpreting various pieces of knowledge in a higher order kind of fashion. Knowledge is most important, most fundamental. Other things then become secondary.